All right. So today's really just for review. But I mean, before we start doing some of that, I'll say a few things, especially if people are watching this after the fact. So, um, the only thing that we should kind of have do here coming up is I posted a video that or quiz that went with a video that I posted up to replace class yesterday. So that's due before the exam starts tomorrow. That's that July 15th quiz. Um, We also have that fourth quiz, which is what right here. So I moved everything to be kind of under this midterm number two exam heading so that we kind of had all of our resources to study for that exam in the same place. So your practice problems, quiz three, and then and actually I think I moved the wrong quiz here because I wanted to make sure. Where is it at? I'll make sure it's down here. I wanted the study version of this quiz to be here, so actually I can do that real quick. Just so we make sure we're kind of working off the right one there. Um, and then once you complete quiz four, you can see which answers you got right or wrong. There's about five of you who submitted this early. There's a couple issues with some of the questions, so I regraded those and have kind of fixed them since then. So if you took it like today, you wouldn't have noticed anything. There's like two questions where it wasn't accepting the negative sign. There was one question where it displayed it as a percent, even though it was in decimal form. So I regraded it as though it was actually the percent. And then there was just one question that had the default first answer chose when it wasn't supposed to be the correct one. So I've gotten all those kind of changes to the quiz. Like I said, only impacted about five of you, and I just went in and kind of manually graded yours on my own. Um, Other than that, that Canvas discussion is due that Tuesday, next Tuesday, so after this exam, so I can see that not really anyone's really posted on that yet, which is fine. I kind of expected that, kind of focusing your efforts on studying for the exam, which is tomorrow. And I put up an announcement about that, kind of detailing the logistics. So 9:30 to 3:30. Once you start, you can't stop. 75 minutes total. Um, you're only going to be displayed one question at a time. You can backtrack. You can have handwritten notes out in front of you. Um, you cannot access any additional browser or any file program on your computer or on your phone. So you have to use that honor lock program, which will flag you if you do any of that. And if I see that you can do any of that, I have a video recording, screen recording for every single person who's taking it. You would receive a zero. Right? You can, broke the academic integrity kind of instructions of its exam, which I have all of this in this announcement, kind of the bullet points for that midterm exam two instructions. Basically, what I just said here. Now, the one thing that I haven't mentioned yet, and I did in that announcement, about 30% of you haven't even tried to access that test exam on HonorLock. Um, I originally had it set to be due Tuesday, so I made sure everyone was getting on and getting it done. At this point, if you haven't done it, the responsibility is going to be on you if you can't get it to work tomorrow. I mean, this is, I've tried to kind of reiterate, I've tried to post announcements to get people to kind of get on this as soon as possible. So you need to get on and get that done, have that test quiz, make sure it's working, make sure your camera is working, that it can access your computer. Granted access when you enable or download the extension, enable it to your device so that we can make sure it's all working tomorrow. Um, So I've got it reopened. You can make multiple attempts if you just want to double check to make sure it's working. You can. You can reach out to me. I can kind of see on the back end whether or not it's recording you correctly, so I can see all of that. Um, so please, if you haven't done that already, try to make sure you get on, download HonorLock. That's what we will be using for this next exam. Okay. Other than that, I think that should cover it before we kind of jump into review, unless there are any questions for me. Oh, also, I wanted to mention if I will be available during that whole time for the exam tomorrow, I'll be checking my email. If you have any immediate questions, feel free to email me. Now, if you're taking the exam, so this is, I'm thinking more of like if you have a problem starting the exam, If for some reason you have technical issues during the middle of the exam, I don't know, lightning strikes and your power goes out. Well, I guess that wouldn't really impact. Well, yeah, let's say that your computer still is working off of a battery. um, I don't know, you're somehow in a public, I don't, whatever it is. If you have a technical issue and you have to email me, the only thing you should do is pull open an additional web page. It will screen record so I can see that, and then just go to your email and email me and await a response. So I'll be able to see all of that. You shouldn't be going anywhere else. If you do, once again, that's kind of breaking the idea of you pulling open a different web browser. But if for some reason there's a question you have that needs to be answered while you are in the process of taking that exam, that's the procedure that you would follow. Okay.
I have a question regarding like the honor lock flagging protocol.
Yep.
Um, I was looking into it and it says that it flags like you looking down frequently. But like if we're using scratch paper and like writing down and like using our calculator, is that going to be flagged?
So it's all automated flagging. It's not like a literal person watching it. What I would try to do is make sure that your screen can like see what's in front of you. I mean, if I can see that it's not your phone, right, then even if it flags it, I can get rid of that.
Yeah.
Um,
Like tilt the screen down, you're saying?
yeah, like a little bit, just so it can
Okay.
kind of, see what's in front of you.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, I mean, if you're looking kind of down, or I don't know, if you do want to, like I said, try to kind of have it captured so that it can kind of see your notes, see paper like at the bottom of the camera, so that way I can, see it's not your phone. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and like in the case that it is flagged and like would it automatically mark it as zero? Or is there a way to like dispute?
No, it'll let me know, and I can go in and like watch the recording and the screen recording and the video recording, and reach out to you, or kind of I can see what was going on,
Okay, thank you.
so I can identify like I don't want to say real flags versus non-real flags, but I can kind of go in and manually update it if I need to. Any other questions? Okay. Getting more people here today than there usually are. So hopefully, does anybody have any questions they want to see kind of worked through? Otherwise, I'll kind of try to pick and choose or come up with some off the top of my head. But really, this is like a time for you guys. And even if it's not a specific question from the practice problem or quiz three, if it's just a general topic, I can try to come up with something on the fly too.
Could you do how I think it's how the response to a deflationary gap?
Yeah. So uh let's work through one. I think in the video I posted yesterday, I worked through a simultaneous shift in aggregate demand and short run aggregate supply. Let's think about what happens if we have a shift in both of them at the same time. So the first thing that I'll do here is we start out, and then I'll get to your question. Sorry, I'm kind of trying to do like multiple into one here. So let's say we kind of start out, here was our price, here was our real GDP. This was kind of our initial level. Okay. Let's assume that we have an increase in labor supply. What is that going to do? Well, it's one of those factors of pull. So it was productivity, other, which was kind of our investments in the physical capital, labor. Oh, hold on. I'm not sharing this with you, am I? Someone should have said something. Sorry. So here's our kind of equilibrium. We have this increase in labor supply. It's one of the factors of pull. It's going to increase both our long run and short run aggregate supply curves simultaneously. And here, sorry, I didn't draw it. These should be all at the same point. So what did that do? It kind of pushed my price down and my GDP up. So this is going to cause my long run aggregate supply to increase, which increase prices both in the short and long run, and to increase GDP. Well, if this is the short and the long run, in both the short and long run as well. So this is going to be our new long run GDP. Okay. So if at the same time, we had the following. Let's say we also saw consumption taxes increase. Okay. So we said aggregate demand was really using that expenditure model to calculate our GDP, so C plus I plus G plus net exports. If taxes are higher, consumption is going to go down. We're going to have a demand decrease or aggregate demand decrease. Now, if we wanted to kind of look at these on their own, this might be helpful initially. So if I've got aggregate demand, long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply, I'll do this pretty quickly here. We kind of start out here. When we have a decrease in aggregate demand, it's going to shift it to the left. In the short run, that pushes our price to be here and our GDP to be here. Right? Now, this is where it hits the short run aggregate supply. So this decrease in aggregate demand causes prices in the short run to go down, GDP in the short run to go down. But in the long run, we return to this point where aggregate demand hits long run aggregate supply. So prices in the long run will still be going down compared to before, but our long run GDP actually doesn't change from those aggregate demand shifts. The only thing that changes long run GDP are shifts in our long run aggregate supply. Okay. So if we have both of these things happening at the same time, what is our total effect going to be? Well, our total effect, and let's think about this is, and we do short and long run. So if I do the short run, well, they're pushing price in opposite. Wait, did I draw this in wrong? Sorry, I wrote my arrow in wrong. What was happening to short run prices? Sorry, short run prices were going down and real GDP was going up. I forgot my second arrow there. Maybe I mix these up here. So both of them are pushing prices down in the short run. So we definitely know that prices in the short run are going to go down. However, they're pushing GDP in opposite directions in the short run. So we don't know what's going to happen to short run GDP. Okay. Now, in the long run, we always know GDP is going to be higher because those changes in aggregate demand, they don't impact the long run GDP at all. The only thing that's impacting GDP is changes in the long run aggregate supply. So there we still see prices are going to be going down in the long run, but we definitely know in the long run GDP is also going to be going up because the aggregate demand shift doesn't change long run GDP. The only thing changing long run GDP is this labor supply. Okay. So, we might look at this and think, okay, well, long run GDP is going to be higher, but what's going to happen in the short run, right? Well, in the short run, it's kind of pushing GDP in opposite directions. So we could think about maybe the answer is we don't know, right? That might be we think that it's indeterminate, right? Well, in the short run, yes, it's indeterminate, right? Whether or not we have a higher or lower real GDP, right? Because these are pushing GDP in opposite directions. But in the long run, we know that that GDP level is always going to lead to the same point. Now, here's where it's a little bit misleading. So we might think the answer is indeterminate, right? However, in the short run, we know that that change in long run GDP, where do I want this at? There we go. It's always going to be no effect of the aggregate demand change, and the only thing impacting long run GDP is this change in long run aggregate supply. So we know that the long run GDP will always be shifting by the same amount as short run GDP. However, that's just from the change in labor supply. Because GDP is getting pushed down by aggregate demand, we're always going to end up in the short run where aggregate demand, like let's say it was a really small shift, it's right here. Well, the new equilibrium short run, it's still higher, right? Um, we still end up with kind of a higher short run GDP, right? But in terms of its relation to the long run GDP, it's less than that. If we had a larger aggregate demand shift, well, we still kind of think about, yeah, maybe real GDP is going down now, right? Depending on which effect is larger. Um, but in the long run, right? So this would be kind of like our new short run GDP. In the long run, we're always going to return to where aggregate demand kind of hits that um, kind of new long run aggregate supply curve, right? So long run GDP won't change. We always know no matter the size of the shift, the new short run GDP will always be less. So if instead I was asking about like what's happening to the directional change in GDP, and I'm just thinking about does an inflation or deflationary gap exist? In this case, we know that that short run GDP, it was always going to be somewhere over here. Okay. So if our GDP in the short run from this combination of two things is always going to be less than our long run GDP, well, their output is currently too low, or we call this a recessionary or a deflationary gap. Okay. So regardless of the size of the shift, we always know that we're going to end up with a deflationary gap here. Now, if I instead just ask you about what happens to short run GDP relative to the initial starting point, well, short run real GDP could be lower, could be higher than the old point. But what we do know is whatever our new short run GDP is, it's going to be less than our new long run GDP. So we don't know what direction short run GDP would change compared to the original scenario when we have these simultaneous shifts, but we do know we'd always end up with a recession or a deflationary gap. Now, I think the original question was, if we have one of these gaps, what happens? So let's say maybe I try to give you an easier example. I can find my other marker. I think it was working better earlier. So let's say I gave you maybe an example where you only had one shift. So let's say we started out with something like this. We had long run aggregate supply, short run aggregate supply. Here was kind of our long run, no, here's our initial price, initial GDP, and we'll kind of call this the long run GDP. If I see something that increases aggregate demand, so actually we'll do one that lined up with my previous example, sorry. Something that decreases aggregate demand. So maybe this is something like people expect to have lower income in the future. That means they're going to consume less today. Remember, aggregate demand was C plus I plus G plus net exports, or maybe we have a decrease in government spending, causes our aggregate demand curve to decrease or shift to the left. Our new kind of short run GDP would be right here. Our new long run GDP returns to the old level. Okay? The only thing impacting long run GDP would be shifts in long run aggregate supply. So just like our previous one where we had simultaneous shifts, we end up with this deflationary or recessionary gap. Okay? So we know that short run GDP and short run prices are right here. We know that eventually, here's where long run GDP and long run prices will be. So anytime we end up with this scenario where short run GDP is less than long run GDP, we have a recession or deflationary gap. So what happens? Well, The only thing that shifts short-run aggregate supply that we talked about were changes in input prices or changes in expected inflation. So let's think about why. So our real interest rates were our nominal rates minus our expected inflation. I think we were using pi to represent that back in the earlier module. But if you want to, right, just inflation. Well, from the short to the long run, what do we expect to happen to prices? We expect them to go down even more. Well, if we expect prices to go down, we expect that there's going to be deflation, or essentially, right, we expect that this inflation is going to be a little bit like, if prices are going down, and instead of 5% inflation, we expect 3, this is actually going to be decreasing. If this decreases, raises real interest rates, which means more firms are going to want to, oh, what did I have here? So expected inflation is, yeah. So higher real interest rates, firms invest more, right? We see this increase in our short-run aggregate supply until we get to this long-run equilibrium level. So if I have a recessionary gap, we're going to see an increase in that short-run aggregate supply until we return to where does the new aggregate demand hit my new aggregate short-run aggregate supply at that long-run level. So in deflationary gaps, we'll see the short-run aggregate supply increase. If we ever had inflationary gaps, right, that would be the exact opposite, right? Because there, we would expect prices to go up. This would lower real interest rates, meaning that companies want to make fewer investments. Excuse me. And there we would see kind of our short run aggregate supply increase until we get back to the long run equilibrium level. So hopefully, that was more than I think you maybe bargained for, but I did a simultaneous shift thinking about the short versus the long run. And then kind of the response to a recessionary gap, and then we would have the exact opposite if we had an inflationary gap. Did that answer your questions, or anything you wanted else to kind of think about in that type of a model? Or
Yeah, that helped. On the quiz, one of the answer options was aggregate demand increasing. Would that ever happen, or is that to address a recessionary gap, or is that like not gonna happen?
um, so that won't ever be the response. No, I wouldn't ask you something like that. I mean, technically, if we had we had an inflationary gap, if there was an additional change to aggregate demand, it could close that gap. But generally, we think about the way that the gap is created is this aggregate demand shift. And then in response to that, what's going to happen? Well, other things won't shift in aggregate demand. It's going to be that short run aggregate supply is what is responding to that aggregate demand shift.
Great,
So
thanks.
no, it's kind of just a distracting answer.
Gotcha.
Any other problems that people had and wanted to see work through, even if it's just a topic? Okay. Um, let's do, since I didn't really do a lot of this in that other video, let's go through two types of questions here. So the first one, MPS, MPC. Yeah, so do you mean like a break-even level? Like actual consumption or yeah, okay. So let's assume do this here. So let's assume that we've got our break-even level formula was we would take autonomous consumption plus investments plus government spending plus exports minus imports, and then let's assume that we have taxes in this model. Okay. And then we divided all of that by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So if I gave you a problem like this, and I simply asked you to find what that break-even level of GDP was, which I could do, right? Let me look at one just so we have some values here. I mean, it doesn't really matter just for the sake of time, though. Hold up. So I think this is going to be similar to question 8 on the practice problem. So let's just use those values. So I've got consumption is 0.78 times YD plus 280. So remember the constant in our consumption function is autonomous consumption. The proportion of our disposable income we're spending is that slope attached to our disposable income. So we would kind of plug those into our marginal propensities to consume. I would then have to tell you what investments, government spending, expenditures, imports, and the level of taxes are. But once you have those values, it's really just a matter of plugging things into this equation. Okay. So if you use the values from question 8, you should get approximately 5,000. So I think having this equation in front of you, it's really just some practice with this equation to make sure you can find that break-even level. I don't, it's really just mainly a calculation. And then the kind of keys there are you should know that from your consumption function, this is autonomous consumption, and then this value would be your marginal propensity to consume. Now, if I told you, say, autonomous consumption, I then told you the marginal propensity to save was 0.4. Well, then what would the marginal propensity to consume have to be? Just 1 minus that, right? So maybe I don't give you the consumption function. Maybe I tell you what the marginal propensity to save is, which you could then back out the marginal propensity to consume. Okay. Any questions there before I kind of add some things into this problem that might be good to know? So let's hit on a couple different concepts here. So let's say I find this value. Once again, it's not exactly 5,000, but it's kind of approximately that. So we've got our disposable income, we've got consumption. When everything, we can think about this as like disposable income of an individual, or we were kind of thinking about this as like our real GDP. So anytime we're consuming every single unit of output that we have, or we're consuming every single dollar that we're earning, that was kind of our 45-degree line, right? This was like our thought of like, this is potential consumption in our economy. I guess not pot consumption, right? Potential consumption. And then here we had what is the actual consumption? Well, that we solved for using our expenditure model, C plus I plus G plus net exports. And then we kind of had this taxes in here. So here was our break-even level, right? We said this was about 5,000. Okay. Now, here's a concept we want to make sure so if I'm ever looking at a point to the left of my break-even level, what must be true? Well, any level of disposable income down here, kind of this line would represent what my disposable income was. However, the actual consumption tells me what my actual consumption was. So savings is going to be my actual disposable income minus that actual consumption. Well, if consumption is greater than my disposable income, my savings here on the left are always going to be negative, or we have dissavings. If I'm ever looking at areas to the right, well, there, my disposable income is greater than my actual income, in which case savings over here, anything to the right of my break-even level, will be positive. So there's some different questions if you're looking at the practice problems or you might see on the exam. So let's assume that we had something change, right? So let's assume that, I don't know, all of a sudden we see government. Let's say we had this to get a little bit tricky. Let's say we saw imports going up, right? So if we saw imports going up, what's going to happen to our break-even level? Well, if this is getting subtracted, subtracting a larger value should decrease our break-even level, or essentially, we're going to see that at every level of disposable income, less of that stays within our domestic economy. We're going to see this decrease in actual consumption. What is that going to do to our break-even point? It's going to push it to be even lower, right, than what it was before. Now notice this old level, which used to be kind of negative savings, right, with our new possible like consumption, that is actually going to be our break-even level where we have zero savings. If we instead had stayed at the old level of disposable income, given the new level of like actual consumption, that amount of disposable income would actually now lead to savings, right? Or it's to the right of our new break-even point. So you might be asked, if there's this thing that changes, so it could be that imports are going up, maybe autonomous consumption is going down, etc. And then thinking about at the old levels of disposable income compared to the new break-even point after you shifted this actual consumption line, what must now be true at that old level of disposable income? And you could say if there were savings or dissavings. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Now, the next thing I want to kind of highlight, since someone asked about these, is when we have that autonomous consumption function. Sorry, when we have that break-even function, we could think about things like what would a change in autonomous consumption do? Let's say it went up by 100. Well, the change in real GDP, or this break-even point, we said would be equal to, well, if we take a derivative in respect to autonomous consumption, it's always going to be 1 over 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. So that change in real GDP would be whatever my change in autonomous consumption is, times what we were calling the multiplier effect. So in this example, if the change in autonomous consumption is 100, I would multiply that by 1 over 1 minus 0.78, and this would tell me the impact. Right? So without doing the math in my head here, so this would be what, 100 times 1 over 2.2. So what's 1 over 0.22? So 5, so 454. So 454, approximately. So we can figure out kind of what impact on real GDP different changes in either autonomous consumption, investment, government spending, exports, or imports would have. Now, what we can also do is figure out what if there was a change in taxes, and let's say it was a $100 increase in taxes. So same amount as autonomous consumption went up by. Well, the corresponding change in real GDP from that, well, notice if I take a derivative of this break-even function in respect to taxes, what I'm actually left with is it would be the change in taxes times marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. However, there's also a negative sign. So just to kind of rewrite this down here to be a little bigger, that change in real GDP would be the change in tax times negative whatever that marginal propensity to consume is over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. So in our example, if taxes go up by 100, there would actually be a what? Use my calculator here again. So we have my marginal propensity to consume was what? 0.78. So I get this. So this is actually going to be 354. If I'm getting my math done correctly here. So the same change in taxes is actually causing GDP to change by a different amount, and it's not actually going up here, right? It's actually going down. Because as taxes go up, we should see lower levels of consumption and lower levels of corresponding real GDP. So we call these kind of the multiplier effects. So that multiplier effect from a change in anything other than taxes, imports, exports, government spending, the multiplier effect there will always be greater than the multiplier effect for taxes because marginal propensity to consume are always less than one. So the numerator will always be less here. That tax multiplier is going to be less than the multiplier effect for any other, categories change. Any questions there before we keep moving?
So does that mean the multiplier effect for like everything else other than taxes is just going to be the 1 over 1 minus MPC?
Yep, with one caveat. What's the only thing that has a slight, so it's still the same value, but what else do we need to be paying attention to?
Imports.
Imports, because they would also have a negative sign, right? So be careful with those negative signs. Increases in either imports or taxes actually should be that it decreases GDP or kind of a negative change. Whereas if we saw imports or taxes go down, well, there it's like a negative times a negative. This would actually lead to real GDP or that break-even level of GDP going up. Yeah,
So the imports would still be the 1 over 1 minus MPC, but it would just be a negative also because of
correct.
okay.
Um, Another thing I could think about that's related to this that you might be, see a question on is thinking about that multiplier effect or thinking about what happens or what is the change in real GDP if, I don't know, investment goes up by 500. So I could kind of as follow-up questions, maybe like two-part questions, say what happens to the change in real GDP from that same $500 change in investments if our marginal propensity to, I'll do a hard one here. Let's say my marginal propensity to save goes up. Well, we know the multiplier effect or the change in real GDP would be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. But remember, the marginal propensity to save plus the marginal propensity to consume should equal 1. So if I just kind of rearrange this a little bit, my marginal propensity to consume is equal to 1 minus this. So if this goes up, this is going to be going up, and then my fraction is going to be going down. So that multiplier effect would actually be going down, right? Every $1 change in investment is going to have a lower impact on real GDP. And then on the flip side, if I wanted to, I could think about, okay, if marginal propensity to consume is going up, or sorry, save is going up, marginal propensity to consume is going down, subtracting a smaller value would increase the denominator, decrease the fraction, kind of tell me the same thing that the multiplier effect there is going to be lower than it was before. Okay. Um, any questions on that before we keep moving?
Is there a specific reason why for the tax and spending multiplier, instead of just making the denominator MPS, it's 1 minus MPC?
You can do it either way. Usually we would use NPC, like generally we just have that from our consumption equation. But really it's just mathematically it's the same thing. 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume is the exact same as the marginal propensity to save.
Okay, thanks.
Any other questions? All right. So another thing I think would be good to review is, let's say, and I'll kind of come up with one off the top of my head here, so you can always go back to the practice problems if you want to. So let's say we've got we're looking at kind of I said we can think about this as like the number of loans. Technically, this is the amount or the quantity of loanable funds that are available, right? Because every loan isn't the exact same amount of money. And then we're thinking about here's kind of the corresponding real interest rates. So we said there's going to be some demand, some supply for loanable funds. There's going to be an equilibrium real interest rate and an equilibrium kind of starting out loanable funds amount. Okay. Give me 1 second, sorry. Computer's doing something. All right. So that's our kind of setup. Let's think about if we have, oh, what do I want here? Let's say that we see that taxes on consumers increase. So if taxes on consumers increase, what's going to happen? Well, I'm less likely to spend, right, if taxes are higher. So as taxes go up, we're actually going to take more of our money instead of buying products. We'll use that to save. So that supply of loanable funds should actually increase, which would do what? Push our equilibrium interest rates down, our equilibrium amount of loanable funds to go up. Right? So we've got real interest rates are falling, the amount of loanable funds are going up. Okay. Now, if simultaneously, there we go. If we had kind of a similar setup, got our supply of loanable funds, demand, but now I'm telling you that, let's say simultaneously we see that business taxes are going, what do I want here? Let's say they're going down. Or another way I could kind of get a similar impact is, let's say profits are increasing. Well, either way, firms have more available funds to make investments or to kind of take loans out, right? They have more available funds to kind of pay those loans off. So they're taking more loans. Their demand is actually going to increase, right? They have more available funds to pay off loans, and so we see they demand more. So what impact is that going to have? Well, relative to kind of where we started out, real interest rates are going to increase, and our loanable funds are also going to increase. So that business tax decrease cause interest rates to go up and also loanable funds to increase. So what do we definitely know is going to happen if we're thinking about total effects? Well, our total effect, we definitely know loanable funds, if these things happen at the same time, are going to increase. However, they're both pushing interest rates in opposite directions, so the answer there will be indeterminate. I would need some follow-up information. So if I told you that the effect of these business taxes was larger than the effect of these consumption taxes, then whichever effect is told you to be larger, its impact will be the one that wins out or that dictates where that total effect is going to be at. So if business taxes have a larger impact, they're pushing interest rates up, then the total effect, if this was true, is that interest rates would be higher than before. But I would have to tell you which of these shifts is larger or which of these effects has a larger change in the market, the loanable funds market, excuse me. Any questions on that one? So two things I want to mention here as well. So first, this is the kind of questions that you'll see on the exam. I don't tell you that there's a shift in the supply or demand. I give you things that are changing. You then need to know which direction are they shifting, supply or shifting demand. And then with those simultaneous changes, what's happening to equilibrium, interest rates, and the loanable funds. And then maybe I give you, a follow-up. I tell you which is larger. You can then don't have to just tell me it's an indeterminate change. You could tell me what direction it does change. Another thing I saw some confusion on, and I will probably be very clear in my language. It doesn't really, I don't have to necessarily be as explicit, but I will be. Um, I want to get this concept when we're looking at any graph, right? So I've gotten some questions about, oh, interest rates shift supply here or demand here, but not here. Well, that's because in different markets, right, we're thinking about graphing different variables on these X and Y axes. So here, when we're looking at that loanable funds market, the only thing that would kind of shift supply or demand is a change in anything other than the real interest rate. If we have changes in the real interest rate, we're just moving to different points on our supply or demand curve, right? So any change in your y-axis variable is just movements along these curves. Any change in anything other than real interest rates here would be shifts in the curves. And then kind of similar with our older previous models, right? We were thinking about here, the only thing that would kind of, if the actual consumption was changing, sorry, if predicted or disposable income is changing, that would just move us to different points on these curves. What was shifting the curves was changes anything other than the actual disposable income. So this was like changes in real interest rates, changes in government spending, changes in imports, changes in something other than what we have on that y-axis. So interest rates, yes, would influence consumption or investments in this model, but we're graphing like two completely different things, right? Our X and Y axis are two completely different variables. Any questions on that before I keep moving here? Okay. So what else did I want to do after this? So we got our loanable funds market. All right. So another question that would come from module 8 that I wasn't really covered in that other video that I think wink wink would be a good one to kind of know is, let's say I gave you something like the following. So I'll come up with these values at the top of my head. So let's say we did GDP, or kind of sometimes we use the notation of Y. Let's say this was 80. We've got consumption is 30. We've got investments into physical, or sorry, not investments into physical capital. Let's say we've got government spending is 20. We've got taxes are 15. Think here what I want. Y minus 7 minus 2. So I then need to tell you. Okay. So let's say I then tell you that there's a budget deficit of 10. Now, if it's a budget deficit, right, we're referring to public savings here. If it's a deficit of 10, then that means that public savings is actually negative 10, right? Deficit implies that we're losing money. So I could ask you a question like the following. What is private savings? Or maybe I ask you here, what What is national savings? Now, the national savings one is actually pretty easy because when we're talking about national savings, this is when we rearranged our GDP equation to be investments here, which we said represented national savings, which is just Y minus C minus G. Well, I've got those values, right? Just what? 80 minus 30 minus 20. I was getting a savings level of 30. Now, if I wanted to do it that way, right, I could then find private savings because I know public savings is negative 10. Investment should also be equal to private plus public savings. Bear with me so far. Well, if I know public savings is negative 10, I've now got investments are 30. What did private savings have to be? 40. Now, another way of solving this, I'm trying to at least think about what I could leave something else off. So if I didn't tell you what public savings are here, but I instead gave you national savings, you could then, why did I do that? Let me think. Yeah, so let's say I didn't give you taxes or transfer payments. You could always back out what government spending is and then go back into kind of public. And if I gave you taxes, solve for kind of the thing you don't know, which is in this one, kind of our transfer payments. Okay. So depending on kind of the version of this question I give you, it may not be quite as simple it may not be quite as simple as kind of like, okay, I've got national savings. Now I know that private savings have to be equal to this. Not could be, but maybe I don't ask you what private savings are. Maybe I ask you what is transfer payments. Well, I've really got two ways of solving for this. Hopefully I get the same value. So my private savings should be Y minus C minus taxes plus the transfer payments that we're getting. So this was our level of private savings. So if I know private savings are 40, GDP or Y is 80, consumption was 30, taxes were 15, plus my transfer payments. So this should be what? So 50 minus 15 is what? 35. So if I subtract 35 from both sides, I think if I solve this correctly, if I'm doing math in my head correct, there should be a transfer payment of 5. Similarly, if I think about public savings, that was taxes minus government expenditures minus these transfer payments. So we said we know the level of public savings. We were given that. So this is like negative 10 is equal to my taxes minus my government spending, but then plus these transfer revenue, or sorry, not plus, minus these transfer payments. So I rearranged a little bit. I've got what? Negative 10 plus 5. So my transfer payment should be, or, so hopefully if I've done my math correctly, either way I do this, I get the same value. So I would expect, wink, wink, to see a question where I maybe give you taxes but not transfer payments. I maybe give you transfer payments but not taxes. And then based off of knowing the level of GDP consumption and government expenditures, you can figure out national savings. And then if I told you one of the other public or private savings, you could then back out what you don't know, total, taxes or transfer payments, and you could then use that to find private versus public savings, right? There's just different variants I could ask you, but knowing how to use those equations and knowing what private and public savings are, and then investment kind of representing national savings here, I could ask you to find like some of the missing parts. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. Any other like types of questions that people want to see worked through here?
Could you do a coupon payment one, coupon rate change, something like that?
Yeah. So, let's see. Excuse me. See if there's a good one. I can pull it out of my head. So, when it comes to coupon payments, let me think. I want to make sure we're making valuable use of our time. Sorry. I have to have my phone on because my wife might call me. I'm sure it's good. So, sorry, I'm looking at the actual exam to make sure I'm giving you questions that are worth going through. Okay, so here's what I would maybe think about instead of coupon rates. We kind of use these to set up a slightly more kind of complex idea, which was kind of present and future values, right? I was using kind of a similar idea. So let's say um, the future payment I'm thinking about receiving, or this could be like my coupon payment. Let's say it was $10,000. I'm going to get that payment at an interest rate of, let's just do 10%. And that's going to be after, I don't know, let's just say 4 years. Okay. So we could think of this in two ways, right? So when a company wants to make an investment into something, they're going to have to take out a loan. Okay. So the amount that they're taking out, we want to figure out what's kind of the present value, the amount of money they're going to have to currently give up if they're going to have to pay this amount down the road. Well, so we would kind of use, sorry, one plus the interest rate to the end. So for us, we're kind of thinking about this gives us our future value or the future payment of 10,000. So we can kind of back this out and say, okay, if I'm going to end up paying $10,000 to take out this loan, what's the current amount of the loan that I'm going to, what's the current amount of money I'm going to get? So this is the idea if, you go and you take out a car loan, yeah, you took out a $50,000 loan to pay for that car, but 4 years down the road, if you then have to pay it up, you're going to be paying even more than $50,000, right? Because every year that loan accrues at whatever the interest rate is. And so we could kind of think about, okay, if I'm taking out a loan, right? If I want, right, to pay $10,000 in the future, I know how that's much is how I'm gonna that is how much I'm going to pay. Then the present value or the amount of money that we're going to receive, right? If this is a loan, I'm going to pay $10,000 in 4 years. The amount of money that I'm actually receiving today in order to do that is only going to be kind of whatever that present value of that payment is. So you can think about this idea that if companies want to make an investment, well, this is the amount of money that I'm currently getting. Okay. So this would be the idea of like the benefit of what I want to invest in is essentially greater than kind of the cost of that loan, right? Then I would want to make that investment. So what's going to happen is, oh, how do I explain this? So we've got interest rates go up, present value goes down. Sorry, think about it this way. The present value, let's say that's the amount of money I'm taking out today. That's like my benefit today is the present value. That's how much money I'm going to be getting today. Right? So if that's greater than, whatever the current cost of that production process is, or, whatever I'm kind of putting this money towards, I want to make that investment. Well, intuitively, if interest rates increase, then what's going to happen to that present value? Well, if interest rates go up, that means I'm going to have to pay more for this loan. That means the same $10,000 and I'm paying 4 years from now. If interest rates are higher, that means I'm going to actually be getting less today. So my present value would be going down, which means that I'm only getting maybe instead of $1,000 from this loan today, even though I'm going to have to pay $10,000 off in 4 years. Now, if the interest rate is higher, that same $10,000 4 years from now, I'm going to receive even less today. So the money I'm receiving by taking out this loan is going to be even lower. It's more likely that that benefit I'm getting today, the amount I'm getting from that loan, if it's going down, it's less likely I choose to take that loan out, right? Or I'm not taking that loan out to make an investment into something today, currently. And then on the flip side, if I'm going to have this increase in the number of time periods, right? Well, that means every year this interest rate, like the amount of money that I'm going to have to pay, right? Instead of just paying, let's say I take out $1,000 loan, the next time period it's 10%, I'm going to have to pay what, 1,100? Well, then if it's 2 years, I take 1,100, multiply that by zero point 0.1, right? It's going to have this compounding interest. So as the number of time periods go on, if I did keep that $10,000 constant, then the present value, right, in order to pay that same $10,000, but now a longer time period down the road, that actually means I'm going to be getting less money today. So if I'm paying $10,000 off in 8 years, that actually means the amount of money that I'm able to get out today is also going down, making it less likely I want to take that loan out and invest that money into whatever project I was thinking about. So thinking more about kind of changes to that present value from changes in the real interest rate or changes in the number of years until I have to make that payment. Essentially, when we're thinking about businesses making decisions to invest currently, they're doing that by taking out a loan. So if the present value of that loan is lower, that means they have less available funds today to invest in these projects. They're going to be less likely, right, to take out those loans. And then if they don't take the loan out, they don't have any money, and so they're less likely to kind of make these investments. Okay? So knowing how interest rates, the number of time periods, and then even you could think about, well, what if instead of paying $10,000 4 years from now, what if I only want to pay 5,000? Well, then the amount of money that I'm going to be getting today is going to be even lower, right? So they're kind of knowing how those three things impact present value, and then thinking about lower present values for these firms are going to mean that the benefit is lower today, and they're less likely to make these investments. Any other type of problem or question people want to see work through? We got what, 10 minutes left? Is there anything else that we haven't touched on today that I think would be good to know? So just as a matter of, just to make a point, we did responses already. Oh, I know a good one that we haven't done. So let's say I gave you a problem like this. Sorry, I'm just trying to make sure I'm making worthwhile use of our time by not giving you questions that you likely won't see pop up on the exam. So let's say I'm looking at our model where we're kind of looking at real GDP or this disposable income, consumption levels when we were spending everything that we were producing, or our real GDP was equal to consumption. We had this 45-degree line. We then thought about here was our kind of actual consumption, and then this was our kind of break-even equilibrium level of real GDP. So let's say we have a change in one of these factors. Well, one thing I'm going to do, and this is just in most of these examples or models, something important to kind of pay attention to, is remember actual consumption was this like C plus I plus G plus net exports, which were exports minus imports. When you think about here, this was also kind of like minus MPC over taxes, essentially. Or you think about if taxes went up, actual consumption went down. Or if imports go up, actual consumption goes down as well. Okay. So if we see an increase in imports, this kind of shifts our actual consumption curve to be lower. So that new break-even level would be down here. So what we said is going to occur here, and this really comes from like our long-run aggregate supply, aggregate demand model. Remember when GDP was too low in the short run, we had a deflationary gap. What did prices do? Well, if we had a deflationary gap, we said we needed short-run aggregate supply um, to actually increase, right? Shift us to the right. So if short-run aggregate supply increased, shift to the right, that pushed real GDP up. We get the same implication in this model. So uh, just as a kind of reminder of where that came from, just to kind of tie these two concepts together, we said we have aggregate demand. If we're ever in a scenario where here's long-run aggregate supply, current short-run aggregate supply for some reason is right here, prices are too high, what did we say we'd have to see happen? Right? Prices are going to adjust or they're going to go down to push us to this kind of long-run outcome. Well, if prices go down, what would that mean? That means that at every single level, use a different color here, at every single level of disposable income, if prices go down, that means our real income goes up. The amount of goods and services we could buy actually is increasing. So if prices, so I can think about this as like my actual income, when prices, excuse me, decrease, right? So if we ever have kind of GDP, that break-even level is too, or sorry, GDP is too low, we close that deflationary gap by lowering prices. How does that increase GDP? Well, as we lower prices, the same level of disposable income at every point, our disposable income is worth more. We would see this like increase in our actual consumption if prices decrease, which yes, we're still going to get a decrease in our real GDP if we had something like imports going up, but it's not going to be as large of a decrease as if prices didn't adjust. Okay. So when prices adjust, we get smaller changes in that real GDP. It may still go down, but because those prices fell, it didn't fall by as much. And then the opposite would be true as well, right? If we had something that increased, so let's say I did something like, so we have actual consumption, got our 45-degree line, and we think about here was our old kind of break-even level. Well, if there was something that increased consumption, that would increase the level of real GDP. But if now GDP is greater, right, we said what we would expect there, it would actually not be a deflationary gap, but an inflationary gap, right? GDP would be higher. We'll see prices adjust that move our short-run aggregate supply backwards. How are those prices adjusting? They're actually increasing. So as prices increase, at every level of disposable income, the actual amount of goods and services we could buy is lower, or this kind of actual consumption with higher prices is going to be a little bit lower. So we still see a change in real GDP, but it's not as large as it was without that price adjustment. So anytime we allow for price adjustments in our model, yes, we could still we're still going to see that the real GDP changes, but it's not going to change by as large of an amount. Any other kind of last minute questions here?
When you say it's not going to change by as much, are you like comparing that to like when other factors change?
So I'm comparing it to the original level. So if we had something that impacted imports, exports, consumption, government spending, that's going to increase this actual consumption line, which increases real GDP, this break-even level. However, if we have prices adjust, that change, right, isn't going to be as large as if prices didn't adjust. So this movement from black to red is if prices don't adjust to, say, a consumption increase. The blue line here, black to blue, that's going to be the increase in GDP from that consumption increase, but after prices adjust. So we would still see GDP going up. It's just when prices adjust, it doesn't go up by as much.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions on that? Okay. So I'll get this video and my previous sections video posted up um, here in the next 30, 45 minutes. Kind of depends on when this video is done compiling. So you'll have those to kind of go back and review. We worked through some pretty similar stuff in my earlier section, but if you have time, it might be worthwhile to kind of go through and see the problems that we worked through there. If you're wanting kind of additional, mainly module 7 and module 8 material. We did a little bit of module 6. I think like one major question in that class, kind of like we did today for our section. But those will get posted here, like I said, in the next 30 to 45 minutes. Otherwise, if you have any other questions, I'll kind of be looking at my email throughout the rest of the day and get back to you as soon as possible. It likely won't be until a little bit later this evening, unless you kind of have a question for right now. So I'm going to end the recording there.